The war had ended, though for many Japanese civilians trapped on the outer Pacific islands, the word end meant little. Bombers no longer roared overhead, naval shells no longer rained fire, but the silence was heavy with dread. For the women of a small village on Saipan, surrender carried its own terror. Rumors had swirled for months. Soldiers retreating through the jungle whispered warnings. The Americans will show no mercy. If they capture you, they will take everything. Death is better. Propaganda posters screamed the same message. The enemy was brutal, dishonorable, dangerous. Mothers told daughters to hide knives under their clothes. Grandmothers muttered that honor lay only in death. So when the American patrols finally entered the village, the women huddled together inside a collapsed storehouse, clutching children to their breasts. Annalise-like figures do not exist here. These were Japanese women, many wives of farmers, some widows of soldiers, others daughters barely into adulthood. They trembled as boots crunched outside, voices barked orders in a language they could not understand. The door creaked open. Sunlight streamed into the dim interior. A tall figure filled the frame, a U.S. Marine, helmet low, rifle slung casually across his shoulder. Behind him, others fanned out across the square. The women froze, their eyes wide, bodies pressed against the wall as though they could melt into the wood. The Marine said something in English, then repeated it louder. No one moved. Finally, through a translator brought by the Americans, the words were understood. "You are prisoners now. You will not be harmed. Stay together. Food will be given." The women did not believe him. Not at first. They shuffled into the sunlight, blinking, their kimonos torn and stained, their hair tangled from weeks in hiding. Some carried infants, others held the hands of younger siblings. They expected rough hands, jeers, perhaps worse. Every nerve screamed that this was the moment of shame they had dreaded. But it did not come. The soldiers formed a line, rifles lowered. They did not approach, did not touch. Instead, one stepped forward and placed a bucket of water on the ground, retreating immediately. Another set down a crate of canned food, pried open with a knife. The interpreter gestured. "For you, eat." The women stared in disbelief. Could this be some trick, a test of obedience? One brave mother bent, scooped water into a tin cup, and drank. The soldiers said nothing. A girl reached for the food. Again, no response, but silence. Slowly, hesitantly, they began to eat. For the first time in weeks, broth touched their lips, soft bread crumbled in their mouths. Children slurped noisily, their cheeks bulging. Mothers wept openly, salt tears mixing with the taste of food. And still, the Americans kept their distance. Night fell, and the women were guided to a makeshift enclosure at the edge of the village. Blankets were handed out, laid on the ground in neat piles. One by one, the women accepted them, waiting for the inevitable, the moment when the soldiers would demand something in return. But none came. The men stood watch at the perimeter, their backs half turned, guarding rather than leering. Whispers spread among the captives. One young girl, scarcely 18, whispered, "Why do they not touch us? Did they not come for that?" Her mother hushed her, but the same question burned in every mind. Inside, guilt clashed with relief. Everything they had been told said the enemy would violate them. Yet here, under a sky filled with strange foreign stars, the Americans treated them with a kind of detached respect. One older woman, Sachiko, clutched her rosary, a hidden relic from her Catholic grandmother. She murmured, "Perhaps their God watches them." Another scoffed through tears, "Or perhaps they only want to torture us later." But as the hours stretched into days, the pattern remained. Food each morning, water refilled, blankets returned clean, and never once did a soldier cross the invisible line that kept the women separate. One evening, as the women huddled around a small fire, a Marine approached carrying a sack. He paused a few paces away, set it down, and stepped back. Inside were brushes, soap, and small cloths. The interpreter explained haltingly, "For washing. For you." The women gasped. Some refused to believe it, too ashamed to reach for the gifts. But one finally stepped forward, trembling, and took a brush. She dipped it in water, scrubbed her child's face until it glowed pink beneath the grime. The boy laughed, the first sound of joy anyone had heard in weeks. Again the soldiers turned their eyes away, giving them privacy. That night, Sachiko wrote on a scrap of cloth with charcoal from the fire. "We were prepared to die. We thought they would strip us of honor. Instead they gave us blankets and food. And they did not even touch us. I do not understand. Perhaps I never will." The shock was not in cruelty, but in the absence of it. In a world ravaged by violence, mercy itself was the most disorienting weapon of all. For these women, the first days of captivity were not the nightmare they had been taught to expect, but a fragile, confusing mercy that forced them to question everything they thought they knew about enemies, war, and survival. The march to the larger camp began at dawn. The women were ordered into line, children clutched against their sides, bundles of belongings tied with fraying rope. Guards walked ahead and behind, rifles at ease, not raised. The women whispered to each other nervously, certain the reprieve would end once they reached the main garrison. Every footstep on the dusty road felt like walking toward humiliation. Rumors ran wild. There they will take us. There the officers will demand their price. Mothers steeled themselves. Daughters lowered their eyes. But when they arrived, what they found only deepened the confusion. The camp was not a dungeon. It was a collection of wooden barracks, tents, and a Red Cross station marked with a painted cross. Inside the enclosure, prisoners were divided into groups, men in one section, women and children in another. The soldiers handed out more supplies, rice, canned milk, even pieces of fruit. The children squealed at the sight of bananas, a luxury they had not seen since before the war. Still, the women hesitated. Every gesture of kindness felt like bait. One mother whispered, "Wait, they will take it back when they take us." But the pattern remained. The Americans gave food, then stepped aside. They handed out soap, then turned their backs. They escorted the women to water pumps, but always stayed a pace away. Days turned into weeks, and still no hands reached where they feared. The shock of absence became its own kind of weight. One afternoon, a medical officer entered the enclosure with 2 nurses. Through an interpreter, he announced, "We will check the health of children and mothers. Anyone who is sick will receive medicine." The women froze. Medical care? From Americans? Surely this was some ruse. But when the officer knelt to examine a coughing child, his touch was gentle. He listened to her chest with a stethoscope, murmured instructions, then handed the mother a small vial of syrup. The mother wept, bowing low, unable to reconcile mercy with everything she had been taught. Sachiko, the older woman with the rosary, whispered, "Our own soldiers told us to die before capture, yet here the enemy tells us to live." Another shock came at dusk one evening. A soldier entered the camp carrying paper and pencils. The interpreter announced, "You may write letters to your families. The Red Cross will send them." At first, the women stared blankly. Letters? The idea seemed impossible. They had believed themselves cut off forever, their voices silenced. Slowly, cautiously, they reached for the paper. Hands shook as they scribbled words. "I am alive. Do not despair. We are captured, but safe." Some simply wrote names, dates, fragments of prayers. Annalise-like characters are not here. Instead, a young woman named Keiko bent over her page, her tears dripping onto the ink. She wrote to her mother in Nagasaki, "I thought I would die in shame. But they have not touched me. They feed us. Perhaps you will see my face again." The letters were collected, folded neatly, placed into a canvas sack. The women watched in silence as it was carried away, unsure if it would ever reach its destination. But the mere act of writing had lifted something from their chests. That night, by the dim light of a lantern, the women talked softly. Some still insisted it was all a performance, that worse would come. Others, younger, dared to whisper hope. Maybe they are different from what we were told. Keiko hugged her knees to her chest, whispering to no one in particular. I have lived my whole life in fear of men. Tonight I wrote my mother a letter. That is more than our own soldiers ever gave us. The Americans continued their strange pattern of restraint. Guards patrolled, but never entered the women's quarters without announcing themselves. When blankets grew worn, they brought new ones. When children cried with fever, medicine appeared, always with the same distance, the same refusal to cross the invisible line the women dreaded most. This very absence became a presence, a shock that gnawed at their beliefs. For years they had been told the enemy was barbaric, lustful, merciless. Yet here, their bodies were untouched, their dignity preserved, their children fed. Sachiko wrote again on her scrap of cloth. The greatest shock is not cruelty, it is respect. We thought they would strip us of honor. Instead, they gave us back our voices. Perhaps this is what it means when people speak of mercy. The question whispered among them now was no longer, when will the abuse come? But why has it not? And in that silence, in that unbroken boundary, the women began to see their captors not as monsters, but as men, exhausted, wary, human. The realization frightened them more than brutality ever could. By late summer of 1945, word of Japan's surrender spread across the camps. For the women, the announcement brought no jubilation, only uncertainty. Would they be sent home? Would they be kept indefinitely? The Americans gave no immediate answers. They continued their routine. Food at regular intervals, medical visits, guards patrolling with eyes averted. The weeks of captivity had left marks, not of bruises or scars, but of confusion. The women whispered in the nights, admitting what none dared say aloud in the beginning. They had not been touched. Not once. No hands reached for them. No soldiers demanded their bodies. No humiliation was inflicted. The absence of cruelty became the defining memory. Keiko, the young woman who had written her mother, received news one morning through the Red Cross. Her letter had been delivered. Tears streamed down her face as she read the reply. Her mother's words trembled with disbelief. I thought you dead. Now I know you live. God has answered prayers I dared not speak. Keiko clutched the paper to her chest, sobbing. Around her, others crowded close, murmuring that if one letter reached, perhaps theirs had too. Sachiko, the elder, gathered the younger women one evening. We were told that death was better than capture. We were told these men would take us, shame us, strip us. But I tell you this, they did not even touch us. They fed us, they guarded us, they gave us back our voices. Her words carried the weight of decades of fear dissolving into astonishment. In September, release orders came. One by one, the women were escorted to boats that would carry them back to Japan. They boarded barefoot, clutching small bundles of belongings. Many carried keepsakes the Americans had allowed them, a bar of soap, a scrap of cloth, a letter tucked inside a blouse. Keiko whispered to her sister, I am more afraid to go home than I was to St. I hear. The voyage was silent, filled with the smell of salt and the distant cries of gulls. When the women finally set foot on Japanese soil, they were greeted by ruins. Cities flattened, families broken, a nation humbled by surrender. Yet they carried within them a story they struggled to tell. How could they explain that the enemy they had been taught to fear had given them dignity instead of shame? Many remained silent, afraid of judgment, afraid neighbors would accuse them of lying or betrayal. But in diaries, in whispered conversations with daughters, the truth survived. Keiko wrote in hers, The Americans did not touch us. That was the greatest shock. For years we were told to fear them as monsters. I found men tired of war, men who chose not to cross the line. That is what I will carry until I die. Sachiko told her granddaughter decades later. I prayed with a rosary in my hand, begging to die before dishonor. But when the soldiers came, they gave us blankets and turned away their eyes. That was the day I learned mercy can be more frightening than cruelty, because it leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew. Historians often measure wars in numbers, battles, casualties, bombs dropped. But for those women, history was measured in silence, the silence of hands that never reached, of boundaries never crossed, of dignity unexpectedly preserved. Years later, as Japan rebuilt and children played in peaceful streets, some of those women would still clutch faded Red Cross letters or the memory of American guards standing watch without intrusion. For them, the war's most astonishing legacy was not destruction, but restraint. It was not the violence they remembered most. It was the absence of it.